If you're a facilities manager at a university, you know students rely on the cafeteria for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and the occasional late-night snack. So when a dishwasher breaks down and dirty plates pile up, the mess hall can turn messy in the blink of an eye. Enter Grainger. With over 1 million industrial-grade products and fast delivery, the product you need now is never far away. So you can turn that dishwasher back into a lean, clean washing machine. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Operation Domination is underway. The ultimate game plan to dominate your NFL experience. With your hosts, Dan Mader.
But what's more impressive to me about the
Chase Thornton.
Yeah, I mean, I got him.
Chris Dowhouse.
Get him, Chase. Get him, Chase.
And Adam.
No, not necessarily, but it's again the same.
Don't hope to win. Be great and dominate.
All right. We're back here with Operation Domination on a special time here on the Saturday morning. Thanks for getting up with us. Some of the hosts aren't up with us yet, but we'll get it going as we get through the show. We got AFC South to talk about. We are now at that pivotal halfway mark through our divisional profile series, talking about all the fantasy football assets and everything that goes along with it. We'll have that. We'll have showdowns. We'll have underdog specials for you guys later on in today's show. As always, I'm your host, Dan Mader. Make sure, if you have not done so, whether you're listening to us on your podcast platform, check us out on YouTube at FF Advice Network. Hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell notification button. That way you get notified whenever new content available to you. Or if you watch us on YouTube, we're also available on podcasts. So when you're out there on the weekends, mowing the lawn, doing your jog, whatever you got to do, take Operation Domination with you by downloading on your favorite podcast app. So like I said, we got the AFC South to talk about, and we do have a special guest. So let's get him properly introduced. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. He's the man, the myth, the legend, the two-time top 15 Fantasy Pros ranker and host of the Fantasy Football Faceoff, the one, the only, Mr. Anthony Cervino!
That was a great introduction. I wasn't expecting that.
I always love the look on the guest's face when they're blown away by it. That's the point. You should be blown away. We're blown away that you're here with us. Thanks for joining the show, man.
No, happy to be here. It's I like the mornings. I'm a morning person, so this is great for me.
Well, this is why we're doing it for you, buddy. And we're doing it for everybody else out there watching Operation Domination too. All right, so let's just get right into it. Again, like I said, AFC South, so we're starting off with the quarterbacks. And one of the top quarterbacks being talked about in this division is Anthony Richardson. Now, of course, he has the upside. We all know with the rushing, only played about 3.5 games, if that, last year. So Anthony, you have him ranked 5, which is the highest amongst this panel. So what do you got when it comes to Anthony Richardson?
This is all about a player I'm willing to take the risk on, because when we saw Anthony Richardson last year, he played 4 games, 2 of which he left in the second quarter. And one of those games he left in the second quarter, he still scored 17.7 fantasy points. In the 2 games where he played full games, he finished as a QB4 and a QB2 on a week. So small sample size. This is a high ceiling player. He's never played a single snap, I don't believe, with Jonathan Taylor. They just re-signed Pittman. They drafted Tyjae Mitchell. They got Downs. Like, this is a loaded offense. And one of the more underrated talking points about the Colts is Stan Steichen, what he's managed to do with Justin Herbert, Jalen Hurts, even Gardner Minshew. He made Gardner Minshew look like a starting quarterback in the NFL, which he is not, in my opinion. But, like, now we get Anthony Richardson. So I'll rank him possibly even higher, because I believe if we get a full season out of Anthony Richardson, he's going to break fantasy football.
I mean, he was on pace for 23 rushing touchdowns last year. Quarterback 4 on a points per game basis. Yeah, all the things you kind of laid out. So the potential is there because of that cheat code as a rusher. Now, Chris, not that you're super low on him, but you do have him at 10. So we're kind of going the other side on this thing. What are some cautions that you have about Anthony Richardson not ranking him in that elite tier?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at Anthony Richardson, you're dependent on one thing and one thing only, basically, is that he's going to rush for touchdowns. And the problem with that is that if he doesn't rush for touchdowns, then what else have you gotten? You got a guy who completed under 60% of his passes, a guy who has arm trouble already, which is always concerning for me when you hear about guys who have arm issues. We've seen Cam Newton's career go down. We saw Peyton Manning's career go down. We go on the list. We saw last year where Deshaun Watson's arm issues in the beginning of the offseason was kind of like, oh, he'll be fine. And then what happened? Deshaun Watson was shut down for the season. So Anthony Richardson has a lot of red flags for me. A guy who only played 4 games, as you guys alluded to, didn't finish 2 of those games. And then on top of it, his explosiveness. I mean, he rushed for his long rush last year was 23 yards. So I go back to, you're looking for a guy who basically had averaged about 6 or 7 carries a game. Now it's hard to kind of project what he would do through the full game because he did keep leaving at injured. But when you look at a guy who has to get in the red end zone consistently with a full healthy Jonathan Taylor for an entire season, an offensive to add all his weapons, as Anthony alluded to, I have concerns Anthony Richardson isn't going to be a guy that I can necessarily have trust in, where there's a lot of other guys in that range that I have more faith in week in, week out. They're going to be healthy and consistent.
Yeah, I will say, Richardson, when it comes to the passing, right, there's a long way to go. His passing metrics, you could pick one out. It's going to be well below average no matter how you break it down. Small sample size. But that was the concern when he was coming out of Florida, was how good of a passer are you really going to be? I want to get the Colts fan perspective in here for this conversation real quick, because we heard the 2 conversations. Anthony's got him up in the top 5. Chris has got him more by 10. And I want to ask you from this question of, what do you think about Anthony Richardson? But also, if you're going to be drafting, is he worth drafting at that higher tier, knowing that there is depth at the position, seemingly on paper at least, going into this season? Adam.
Yeah, I think it's team build to team build, just kind of the way the board falls in the individual draft, because there's definitely ones where I get it, going with Anthony Richardson for that gamble being worth it, because he very well could end up as a QB, like the QB1. Like, that's within the range of outcomes. QB 30 is also within the range of outcomes. This is like a high risk, high reward gamble. So you better be prepared to get a solid QB2 if you're going with an Anthony Richardson, in my opinion. As far as he goes, Chris, I agree with a lot of your concerns. Anthony, I agree with a lot of, the upside there. The one concern that, to me, at least in the short term, I'll say I'm not overly worried about, is the arm. Now, if that pops back up as an injury, like, I think that's a real concern. And if that, shortens the career towards the end of this thing, that's a real concern. But everything I've seen, I'm not going to say like, him throwing on air, like accuracy wise, like you can't get any real gauge of that. But I can see like zip out of the hand on air. Like, that's something you can see and it looks normal, like well enough. So that's one that I'm not at least super concerned about in the short term. But, again, like, as an injury popping back up, totally. As an injury long term, totally. I just think the zip is still there for now.
Real quick, are you concerned about the style of play, being altered or being encouraged to be altered as a result of that as well, which is going to damage that opportunity for rushing touchdowns, especially in the red zone? Not
really. Shane Steichen, to me, has so far been a straight shooter. No, we don't have a super long sample size with him. He's been a head coach for, the one season. But he keeps going again and again. Like, he needs to be, maybe a little bit smarter about making those decisions, but I'm not going to tell him not to run, and we're still going to use his legs because that's why we drafted him. So at this juncture, Shane Steichen's given me no reason to doubt him when he says that, because he hasn't really, outright lied to my face before. Ballard has about like Taylor and whatnot last year, but Steichen never really, was jumping on that sword. So I still trust him in that regard.
Well, let's throw this out there, too. Shane Steichen's also responsible for the push-tush coming in to play here with Jalen Hurts being a weapon in the red zone. I don't think he's going to take that away when he has Anthony Richardson's skill set. Let's talk about another AFC South quarterback. This one made me look good for at least a year because I got a lot of flack last year for saying CJ Stroud should be drafted as your number one. I had him over Anthony Richardson, even in Dynasty rookie mock drafts, because I just thought he was going to be that good of a quarterback. So far, so good. Chase, you have him at the highest as far as a redraft goes going into 2024. You got him at 5. So what are you looking at? What do you like about CJ Stroud? Why do you think he avoids the sophomore slump?
Well, I think I think he's definitely a top 10 caliber quarterback for this season. 5 might be a little high. I might be riding a little bit of the CJ Stroud, wave that everybody's on right now. But
it's your ranking. Be confident in it.
But I am saying that, you're talking about a guy that in his rookie campaign was quarterback 9 overall, quarterback 9 on a points per game basis there and have PPR. The kid's got it. Plus they went out and they got him Stephon Diggs. He's going to have a healthy Tank Dell. He's going to have Stephon Diggs as his number 1. Nico Collins is his number 2. Tank Dell is the number 3. And Dalton Schultz is still there. Also, they went out and they improved his run game by getting him Joe Mixon. This is a team that had a middle of the road, offensive line here. So, he's got an offense around him that there's no reason he can't repeat what he did last season. It wasn't like he shot the lights out and did something that's completely crazy in terms of his completion percentages or anything like that. In fact, he had one of the lower completion percentages in the top 12 of the lowest completion percentage in top 12 quarterbacks. So there's even room for improvement there. I think with a better run game this season, I expect them to be a better run game with Joe Mixon and to have a little bit more production there. They should be staying on the field more because they'll be getting more first downs. They'll be improved that way. I don't think there's any question that Joe Mixon is a step up from what Singletary and Pierce were giving them last season. So, just with everything around them, it's not hard to imagine some regression from Dak Prescott's MVP level, season last season. We've got questions about guys like, Jordan Love, my guy, Jordan Love. Can he repeat his performance from last season? So, there's enough there that you can say that he can make it to number 5 overall. Now, that being said, he's being drafted number 5 overall. I'm probably not going to have a ton of CJ Stroud at that price right now. Guys that went in similar range last season at the quarterback position, Justin Herbert and Justin Fields, the two Justins, and we all know what happened to them. Herbert ended up the season 17 overall. Fields ended up the season 18 overall. You could have got Dak Prescott several rounds later, being drafted as a quarterback 9. There you can wait on quarterback and still get value and still get commensurate value from what I think you're going to get from CJ Stroud. So I probably won't have a ton of him coming up this year, but 5 is probably his ceiling. And if you don't mind drafting at the ceiling, go ahead and take CJ Stroud. I think he's going to have a good year. The ADP is a little rich for what I want to do this year with my builds, though.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point to bring up. Look, I just want to point this out here. CJ Stroud, great season last season, quarterback 11 on a points per game basis. He hit the 4,000-yard mark that you're looking for, but only 22 touchdowns. And that was in 15 games. His pace would have been 26 touchdowns. I've talked about this before. I'll bring it up every show. You got to hit, as a pocket passing quarterback, you got to hit 30 touchdowns in order to have a chance to be in that quarterback elite tier. Now, with the addition of Stephon Diggs, I think he's got a chance to be able to do that. Of course, the weapons are going to be surrounding him everywhere. But then, Chase, and this is going to be my question to Anthony, you kind of bring up a good point. Going right behind him is Anthony Richardson at 6, Joe Burrow's at ADP 7, Jordan Love, Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray, Brock Purdy. Those are the next 5 quarterbacks after that. And I don't know if I love CJ Stroud that much more than those guys. So what do you think, Anthony?
Yeah, I can see myself possibly knocking Stroud down another spot. I have him at 7 right now. And when you look at his finish last year, there were a few quarterbacks who had high quarterback finishes, but we also need to consider the number of quarterbacks who were injured and not accounted for, like guys like Joe Burrow and Anthony Richardson. There were quite a few quarterbacks, Kirk Cousins, Aaron Rodgers, who are now going to be back up into this mix. So how high would Stroud have finished last year? Now, we factor in Stephon Diggs into this passing attack, but we also have to factor in Joe Mixon. With Mixon's by far a vast upgrade over Devin Singletary and Dameon Pierce. The Texans last year, they were 12th in team pass plays per game. With Mixon and what we believe should be an upgraded defense in year 2 under Miko Ryans, are they going to have to pass as much? And also Stroud, you brought up his low number of touchdowns. He only had 2 games where he passed, I believe, for over 2 touchdowns last year. And then he had another one in the postseason. So, like, in fantasy, like, I like CJ Stroud. Really good NFL quarterback, but I need to see it as a fantasy quarterback before I put him anywhere close in my top 5.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. What about this guy, Trevor Lawrence in Jacksonville right now? I mean, this is somebody I know last year people drafted him ADP quarterback 9, finished as a QB 17 on a points per game basis. It was, excuse me, it was hugely disappointing from that standpoint. We didn't get that 3rd-year breakout that we were hoping for. But when I look at Trevor Lawrence, I see a guy who has a lot of reason to hope. I mean, you look at some of his metrics last season. The volume was there. It was 8th in pass attempts, 5th in deep ball attempts. So the big plays were trying to be made. They ran the 2nd best pace of play for an offense. He was 9th in both carries and rushing yards with 70 and 339. All the makings of they can get this thing right and start hitting on some of those big plays. I think Trevor Lawrence could shock people. That's why I'm highest on this board actually at 13. And I got a frog in my throat that I can't get rid of, apparently, over it. But I love the weapons of Brian Thomas. I love that they brought in Gabe Davis, and not because I think they're super. I think Brian Thomas could be a superstar, but not because I think they are superstars, but because I think they fit what it clearly was what Jacksonville was trying to do last season. Hopefully, have Christian Kirk back for the whole year. We know you have Evan Engram. You have Travis Etienne. I like how this is mixing up where people are now taking Trevor Lawrence at 15, ADP 15. And I think he is somebody who does still have top 12 potential with a better makeup around him. Anthony, do you agree or disagree with that?
I agree. I like Trevor Lawrence. I was one of those people, I was super high on Jacksonville last year. I bought all in. And for whatever reason, like the defense kind of broke down. The offensive line wasn't great. And it just didn't look like the same offense as we saw under year 1 under Peterson. Now, you mentioned 3rd-year breakout. I kind of give that year 1 of Trevor Lawrence a mulligan because it was so dysfunctional with Urban Meyer to where I kind of look at this year as his true 3rd year in Doug Peterson's system. So maybe last year was a 2nd-year regression, and now we're going to get that 3rd-year breakout now that he has stability with Doug Peterson. So that's kind of my outlook, but I like Trevor Lawrence. I don't put too much stock into his contract because they had to pay him. You have to pay him market value because if you don't, somebody else will.
And you're Jacksonville. Let's get it clear here. No one's coming to Jacksonville. This is the best shot you got, 100%. All right. So the Tennessee Titans, they also are trying to figure out if they have a quarterback of the future. Now, I don't think any of us are really drafting Will Levis for fantasy purposes, especially not in 1 quarterback leagues and even super flex leagues only as a backup only. His ADP is sitting at 28 right now. But there are some in the industry clamoring for the idea that Will Levis could surprise us. I'm not that kind of a subscriber, but Adam, I'd love to get your thoughts.
We'll get into it a little bit later with me, but I am not high on this passing offense, really in the slightest. So, yeah.
It's like, that's it. I just hate you altogether.
I want to be able to speak later when we have that conversation.
That's fair enough. Here's what I'm going to say about Will Levis. I know he had the 1 good game. And if it wasn't for that 1 good game, he would not have the supporters that he has, man. Like, everything was dreadful. I mean, talking about 58% completion percentage, 35, ranked 35th in true completion percentage, 35th in pressure completion percentage, 34th in play action, 27th in clean pocket. So when you actually have blocked around you, because everyone brings up, well, the Titans offensive line. Okay, well, when he did have a clean pocket, he sucked then too. I am not a believer in Will Levis. I look at this guy, and I get flack for this all the time. I don't care. He's Zach Mettenberger to me. All right, it's Zach Mettenberger all over again. Big arm, no accuracy, completely wild, 24/7 every time he drops back. And unless those fundamentals take a Josh Allen like unique development, like when Josh Allen went through a quarterback's coach and spent all off season just totally rebuilding his mechanics. Unless Will Levis does that, I don't see this guy long for this league, at least not as a starting quarterback. Anthony, I saw you make a face there. Go ahead.
And I'm going to preface this with that game last year where Will Levis looked good, he didn't really look good. That was all DeAndre Hopkins. Now, we fast forward to this offseason, and my mind completely changed on Will Levis, not so much because of Will Levis, but the organization, they're showing us, okay, we're going to move on from Vrabel. You bring in Callahan. You bring in Callahan's father, one of the best offensive line coaches ever. They spent back-to-back years, top 10 picks to rebuild this offensive line. They spent a lot of money on running backs, wide receivers, and really getting this offense right. They don't want to be a part of this Mike Vrabel, bad offense, let's play ugly football. They want to play pretty football and throw the football. And if you look where Callahan comes from, they were 3 deep at wide receiver. They have that now. Versatile running backs. They have that now. So I am buying into Brian Callahan, and I'm buying into the organization buying into Will Levis. And this is the entire offense is low risk, high reward. If you look at everybody's ADP across the board, right. Low risk, high reward. And more for best ball, I am getting my fair share of Titans offenses in best ball, and I play in a lot of leagues. If you play in volume leagues, this isn't a bad team to have some stock in as I don't want to say backups, but like on your bench. You know, Will Levis is free. Guys like Calvin Ridley, they're your wide receiver 3.
Yeah, look, we're talking best ball leagues. Yeah. That's, to me, that's a completely different conversation. 100%, because you need to take those shots in best ball leagues. Yeah. And again, you don't have to worry about if they flop the 1 week. You don't have to plug them in anyway. You're not worried about if you're starting them anyway. So it's a different story for me with best ball leagues. It's also a different story with the organization. I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, the organization did a hell of a job of saying, we are going to give our quarterback every opportunity to succeed. This is Will Levis is my take on Will Levis is separate from what the organization did. Your reps brought in the offensive coach, brought in more weapons. They did what the Bears did, and finally the light bulb went off. I'm going to put weapons around you, and at the very least, we're going to figure out if you're the real deal or not. I don't necessarily look at it as we have faith in Will Levis. I look at it more of, we're going to find out this year. Are we moving forward with you as our guy, or are we not? And I think that's more of the take on it for me from that standpoint.
No, I think that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
Fair.
We got us. Let's see. We got a comment coming in here. Uncle Ted. These guys are still bringing a fantasy magazine to their drafts. Okay, cool. Thanks, Uncle Ted. Anyway, let's go to our running backs. And we got Jonathan Taylor. We all have Jonathan Taylor here sitting up at the top 5. Adam, you have him right at 5. What's your take here on Jonathan Taylor this year? How excited should we be? What is his range of outcomes?
Yeah, I think the range of outcomes is pretty good because, look, on the bad end of the Anthony Richardson debate, right, where everything Chris says is true, the whole thing falls apart, well, then he's the identity of the offense. That just immediately becomes like, well, Jonathan Taylor, you're the guy, you're carrying this thing. This is all you. Like that's the next step. If everything goes wrong with Anthony Richardson, and then the Anthony Richardson thing goes well, it's like, all right, cool. We have a running quarterback. Every time we've seen that, we've seen like, okay, maybe you lose a little bit in the end zone. Like that sucks, but the efficiency like jumps like crazy. Miles Sanders went from like one of the most efficient yards per carry running backs with Jalen Hurts to being a complete bum in Carolina. And everyone that's ever ran with Lamar gets like 5+ yards per carry because, yeah, you have to, part of the rushing defense has to be, around the quarterback. So I think either you're going to get insane efficiency with Richardson also doing well, or, all right, you're the identity of the offense. And that's like the two options that can really happen with Jonathan Taylor here is obscene volume because the passing game won't work, or obscene efficiency because it is.
Yeah, I think all of that is fair. So we're 2 years removed, or three years removed now, 2021, when Jonathan Taylor had his RB1 type season. And that year, I just wanted to bring that year up, is when he had 51 targets. Anthony, when we've seen these scrambling quarterbacks, these dual threat quarterbacks, they tend to not check the ball down to the running back. Now, Taylor's not dependent on his receiving ability, but it is a nice notch when you're talking about a guy who's in this tier right now. So you have any concerns about that?
I do have some concerns, but if we look at the past 2 years, the receptions obviously have gone down. Jonathan Taylor's capable of being a receiver out of the backfield, but he's not dependent on it. And I look at him almost like Derrick Henry. I think Jonathan Taylor can put up those big Derrick Henry fantasy numbers and not necessarily be a big contributor as a receiver out of the backfield. And you brought up like the efficiency. Jonathan Taylor should be ultra efficient in this offense because of that threat of the RPO and Anthony Richardson.
Yeah, 100%. The touchdown should be there. So I'm excited about Jonathan Taylor. Got him at 4. Let's talk a little Joe Mixon. All right, so he moves to Houston, somehow finds a way, even at 29, to still be in the same situation of being on a good offense. It's going to score a lot and still be the main bell cow because the depth chart behind him is a lot to be desired. I mean, we still got Dameon Pierce there, who I think if the coaching staff had their way would have already moved on from him, and it doesn't seem like he's going to play too much. Daria Agunboale, there we go, finally said the name right. He might factor in a little bit, but we know Joe Mixon's a great pass protector, so he's never going to lose out on his pass catching role to a huge extent. Chris, you have him at your RB12. The thing about Joe Mixon for people, I believe, is that while they recognize he's in a good situation, he's good at scoring touchdowns, he's going to provide a base floor of fantasy points, no one's that excited about him. So how do you kind of rectify that within yourself when you're looking at a Joe Mixon as a top 12 running back? Are you going to draft him there or not?
Yeah, I think he's a top 12 running back, and you draft him there because he's one of the guys you talked about that has a clear role in the backfield. He's going to be the alpha running back. Now, I don't know if Dameon Pierce is going to go away. He should go away, but the coaching staff keeps talking. You talked about they want him to go away. They keep talking him up, every offseason. But when I look at a team that has, some offense, has a huge, offensive upgrade with Stephon Diggs, I think you already had saw C.J. Stroud going into a second year. You have weapons throughout the thing. You can't key on stopping the running attack. And we saw Devin Singletary have, pretty good production towards the end of the season. So Joe Mixon kind of lives and dies by his touchdown rushes. I think Texans overall, that offensive line was decimated by injury to start off the season. It shouldn't be on like his 5th string guy by week 3. So if that's the case, I think you're going to have a more efficient Joe Mixon than you started off the season for Houston's running game. You're going to have a team that's being able to move the ball down the field, and we see usually these running backs, a la in the 49ers, a la the Dolphins, usually produce these kind of systems. So I think Joe Mixon's in a good situation. I don't love his upside any higher than that, Dan. I don't think he's going to be a guy you have top 5 or anything like that, but I do think top 12 is a guy, one of the safer guys you could probably have follow the money.
Yeah, you mentioned something kind of interesting there. I would love to get Anthony's take on this, is that the system, we know that this system has been built for good running backs to excel. But what I find interesting, and the system itself, that Shanahan system may be changing a little bit. We've seen Shanahan kind of move to more of a gap scheme anyway. But what I find interesting is that Joe Mixon, his efficiency as a zone scheme runner is not that good. He's much better as a gap scheme guy. He's much better out of shotgun than he is under center, believe it or not, even though he's not really a fast guy. It surprised me when I looked at the numbers. Anthony, does that concern you at all that maybe this system isn't necessarily a great fit for Joe Mixon?
I'm still going to be in on Joe Mixon's system side because we know what we're going to get out of Joe Mixon. He's a 3-down back. He's one of the rare 3-down backs left in the NFL. Reliable receiver out of the backfield. Things that you guys already hit on. He can pass protect. Wasn't always the most efficient back. I think going back to 2018 was his most efficient year, 4.9 yards per carry. Every other year since, under 4.1. But he can handle volume. He's good on the goal line. He's not the sexiest draft pick in the world in fantasy. He doesn't have a high ceiling despite his RB6 finish last year, but I'm fine. I have him on the fringe as my RB13. I can see myself moving him up a spot, moving him down a spot. But I think he's a fine draft pick. He's going to be fine in that offense. And system or not, again, this is an offense that had Devin Singletary, Dameon Pierce last year. Mixon will be an upgrade over those guys, regardless of system.
Yeah.
Dan,
okay, Chris.
Can I jump in about the system real quick, too? Look at what the offensive line was in place in Cincinnati. I think it kind of you recognize that line wasn't built to be a zone blocking line. So I think it's also part of the equation.
That's fair. Yep. And we'll see if, the Callahan, who's renowned for being an offensive line developer, they catch on to that in Tennessee. I don't know. Just saying. But anyway, let's get into Travis Etienne. Travis Etienne's interesting to me, right? Because I'm never wowed by him when I watch him play. He just does everything well. Like that's just like what it sets up to do. And he gets his hands on every aspect inside the 5, on passing downs. He is a bell cow back. We could talk about Tank Bigsby all day long, guys. Tank Bigsby, I'm not a fan of Tank Bigsby. Okay. They tried to make him a thing last year. It didn't work. I don't think he's suddenly going to be a thing this year. Chase, you looking at Travis Etienne. He's in your top 9. What's your value? What you think his range of outcomes are this year?
I think you can argue for him right now without even having touched a football so far this year. I think you can argue for him at least as high as 6. I mean, I've got him ranked behind right now Kyron Williams, Derrick Henry, Jahmyr Gibbs, but I think there's an argument that he could very well outperform all of those guys. I mean, listen, you kind of brought it up. I've never been a Travis Etienne fan necessarily, but I am a fan of volume in fantasy, and this dude is going to get the volume. There is literally no competition in that backfield. Tank Bigsby is clogging up the Jaguars roster just about as much as he's clogging up your dynasty rosters. There's no reason to have him. I like D'Ernest Johnson as a player, but he's not going to be a threat either. The only way that either of those guys sees the football with any kind of regularity is if Etienne gets hurt, and I'm not going to try and put that into the universe right now. Listen, this team was 6th in the league in pass attempts, and he still finished in the top 10 in targets, in receptions among running backs, but he also finished in the top 5 in rush attempts. I mean, he is going to get volume. There's not another back necessarily in football right now who maybe is going to get as big a percentage of his team's carries than Travis Etienne. So I like him for 70 plus targets again, 250 plus carries again. There's no reason that he shouldn't be a solid top 10 running back on everybody's board right now.
Here's 2 things that do concern me a little bit about Etienne, taking him where his value is, of course, as a top 10 running back. And Anthony, you could tell me, what do you think about this? Right now, last 2 years, he's kind of fell off towards the end of the year, especially in playoff time. Like last season, he was the RB 15 in points per game basis from weeks 13 through 18. I mean, he did only have a 3.86 yards per carry. Some of that is on the offensive line, of course. He was fine in evading tackles. He was 4th in evading tackles, and it was 44th ranked in run block rate. So just kind of give you an idea here as far as what kind of offensive line he was dealing with. Are you concerned at all, though, about the second half season drop off that we've seen the last couple of seasons?
I mean, if we go back into his injury history in 2022, had a foot sprain in week 12, and it didn't, appear at a lot of injury reports or missed games, but injuries like that, they're running backs. That's going to linger. And last year in week 12, bruised rib. So there is some reasoning behind a possible decline. Also last year, especially Jags offense, it just didn't look right. It never seemed to click. Now, there's a report going out there from Doug Peterson during OTAs that they're going to manage Etienne's work. I feel like we hear this every offseason.
Yeah.
And the only way that happens is if Tanks Bigsby or D'Ernest Johnson somehow play efficient football and do, have some meaningful reps. Like, I don't trust these guys behind them. So, I would be pretty comfortable continuing to draft Travis Etienne as if he's going to be the guy. Because the only way he's not going to be the guy is if Tank Bigsby all of a sudden does a 180.
Right. Yeah, totally agree. Speaking of guys with splits and backfields, Tennessee is a big one people are trying to figure out right now. They paid Tony Pollard to come in, so they definitely want Tony Pollard to come in and at least be the lead guy. But Tyjae Spears is a very good player, however, was not part of this regime. I think people kind of sometimes forget about that. This was not their pick. Tony Pollard was their guy. Adam, what would be your estimation and why on what the split between a Tony Pollard and a Tyjae Spears will be?
I think at least to start the season, we're looking at like in the 60 to 65 to 30 to 35 ballpark. I do think as the season progresses, Spears can probably climb into that a little bit because, look, I wasn't super impressed with Pollard last year, and I know he had the injury coming into the season. I know that type of back probably just shouldn't be getting the volume that he was getting, and with there being a split, in Tennessee, that it probably should be a little bit better for Pollard, but he did still get a year older, so how much does that, balance out? Again, I think Pollard probably is a little bit more efficient this season than last, but look, Callahan's got a lot of work to do with this offensive line outside of the center. There's not a ton of proven talent. There's, some prospects we really like. Both of them on the left side are, guys who I liked coming out of college. So I'm not saying that, it's not that they don't have talent. It's that outside of the center position, said talent hasn't necessarily proven itself yet. So I think this run game could be good. I think there could be something, but I also think that there's a decent shot Pollard's not as efficient as Spears ends up being, and Spears starts cutting into it towards the end.
Big time.
Yeah. Go ahead, Chase. What do you think?
No, I was just going to say, listen, if you're doing 0 RB or hero RB, Tyjae Spears should be the top of your list for guys to be targeting late. You can get him in the 9th round here. And I think that as the season progresses, he definitely takes over. I think it starts out Pollard is their run back. They try and, use him. It's a different regime here, but last year, obviously they wanted Spears to be the passing running back, the pass down running back, and they wanted Henry to be their running back. Pollard, I think, starts out with a little bit more of that role. I think Spears has a little bit more of the passing role, but I think as the year progresses, I think Spears' explosiveness, I think that his efficiency, like Adam alluded to, I think it takes over. So as the season progresses, I think he takes more and more and more of this. I'll bet on the younger running back. It's running back after all, and youth rules. But yeah, if you're going with a 0 or hero RB approach, I would have Tyjae Spears at the top of my list for guys that I would be targeting later in the draft.
Man, you guys just hate Tony Pollard. I mean, the guy's getting drafted at running back 30, which I think is already a steal. I got him at 24. I'm much stronger on Tony Pollard than I guess anybody else is. Anthony, I'll get your thoughts here in a second. But, I mean, he signed a 3-year, $21.75 million deal with $10.9 guaranteed. That's not insignificant for a running back. That's not somebody you bring in to be a backup running back. And, yes, last year wasn't great. He was drafted as the RB6. He finishes as the RB22. That definitely scorned quite a few people, but we saw a hell of a drop off in efficiency. And when you get more touches, you typically are going to be a little bit less efficient. That's just typically how it works. But he went from 5 yards a carry to 4. Could he easily bounce back to 4.5? Yes, I do think he could easily bounce back to 4.5. And for Tyjae Spears, he was impressive, but he had a clear-cut role, right? Derrick Henry handled the early downs, handled the goal line situations. Tyjae Spears worked in on passing situations. Well, it's not going to be clear-cut for him this time around because Tony Pollard handles all those things the way Tyjae Spears does. Mm-hmm. So if anything, you're talking about a split where it's less than 50% for Spears. And I don't see why Spears is definitively a better running back that he's automatically going to take over by the time the season's done with Tony Pollard. Anthony, what are your thoughts on that?
This is one of the harder backfields for me to dissect because both of these players do a lot of the same things well. With Tony Pollard, what he doesn't do well, and it was glaring last year, Tony Pollard had the second most red zone touches of every running back. He had 72 red zone touches, 9 on the goal line. He could not punch it in. He was not effective in the red zone. And when Pollard was at his best, Ezekiel Elliott was handling it. It was almost like the Spears Henry, although that was Zeke and Pollard. So, is this a situation where maybe we see closer to a full split workload at some point? Because I think both of these guys would benefit from a reduced workload efficiency-wise. So they're not getting those hits all the time. They're not getting tired. There's always a fresh back that does the same thing. So that's almost my take on it. They just do so many of the things well. Is this going to be closer to a 50-50 split? Maybe not to start, but at some point.
Yeah, well, that's fair too. Right now, though, I think they're both values. Again, Pollard going at ADP RB 30 and Tyjae Spears going at 33. I think they're both values there, whether it's best ball or redraft leagues. Let's dive into these wide receivers. Michael Pittman off the top, the volume gobbler himself. Chris, you have him at wide receiver 20. We all have him as a wide receiver 2. Some of us have a mid-level. You have more of a lower end. You look at Michael Pittman, and why do you have him maybe a little bit lower than ADP consensus right now?
I think, Anthony talked about earlier in the show, some of the guys that were injured at the quarterback position. I look at some of the guys who are injured at the receiver position, and I start filling in some of those gaps and some of the guys that I think will slide in ahead of Michael Pittman. I think that the added weapons, isn't necessarily going to hurt Pittman because I don't think Richardson can make multiple reads. But I do think there'll be an effort to try to involve other guys, and as a result, it could hurt his targets in that kind of, that way. I think Michael Pittman could be a guy who wins the league for you if Joe Flacco is the quarterback for this team by the end of the season. But other than that, Michael Pittman, I think, is a guy that has a limited upside, who has a very consistent floor, but kind of reminds me of Keenan Allen a couple of years ago, before he became that, was always getting you that solid floor, but never really that high ceiling. So you got the average games, you got a touchdown here, you got 70 yards, you had to kind of depend on the 6 or 7 catches. Michael Pittman's upside to me is my concern, Dan. I think there's a lot of guys here that are going to kind of be pigeonholed to be those stretch the field guys with, Pierce, with Downs, with Mitchell. So what does this kind of leave his reality to people that's underneath stuff? I think he's really good at that, but I have some concerns that they're going to, not be able to feature him enough to be a guy I trust in my lineup as a stronger receiver 2 option.
The upside part, I do agree with. I mean, that's been Pittman's downfalls. He doesn't score touchdowns, right? The most he's ever had in a season is 6. He had 4 last year, even though he had 150 targets, and they weren't necessarily going to a lot of other guys. And we know he doesn't get necessarily the big plays with it. I do think it's nice, though, to know that if Richardson does go down with another injury, we actually like him with the backup quarterback. So I think that does play a little bit well here as far as his floor goes. And I think when you're taking Pittman, you're taking a guy that I want that wide receiver 2 floor. Maybe that's not necessarily as exciting as some other guys who maybe have some more upside, but I don't worry about the volume. I mean, especially while Richardson's the quarterback, people are like goo goo gaga over Josh Downs. I'm like, you're talking about the guy who's wide receiver like 75 when Richardson was playing, only was getting a 15% target share. When Richardson was playing, like it was all Pittman all day long and nobody else. So Anthony, do you think Pittman's ever going to get to that point where he has that upside? Like what is it about the touchdowns? It doesn't seem to matter what the quarterback is. I don't get it.
Look who we share as an offense with when you have Jonathan Taylor there. In the red zone, Taylor's probably going to absorb a lot of those red zone opportunities, and now we have Anthony Richardson. I like Michael Pittman a lot. I'm okay. Like, not everybody can have a wide receiver 1 ceiling. Not everybody can be a top 5 receiver. I think Michael Pittman being a high floor guy and drafting him where we are, I don't mind it. But we also have to remember this Steichen offense, what he managed to do in Philadelphia with a running quarterback like Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts still threw the hell out of the football. A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith were still monsters as receivers. So I think there's some, we're drafting Pittman for his floor, but I think there's hidden ceiling in there. And that's all relegated, or not relegated, but that's all dependent on when and if Anthony Richardson develops as a passer, because we already know what he can do as a runner. If he starts clicking as a passer and with these weapons and even Jonathan Taylor, like we're looking at a potential top 10 offense.
Yeah. I Adam loves to hear that down there. I'm sure he does.
I mean, that's just, we don't even know what Mitchell is yet.
Yeah.
One
This
super
could be a special offense.
What'd you say, Chris?
Chase just hates Ed.
Yeah. Oh, you mean the way he's going to utilize, right? Not from a talent perspective. Yeah. Okay. So we definitely like them a hell of a lot more.
One super brief thing on the red zone topic with Pittman. Super brief. Just he's never had a quarterback with any zip at all in the red zone. For a guy that isn't a big separator, like I think that does matter at quite a bit. Not to say that he's going to suddenly be a 12 touchdown guy, but to get above 4 or 5, like I think there's definitely room to tack on a couple extra if you have a little more zip, whether that's Flacco or Richardson.
Yeah, and the dude was wide receiver 15 last season. No, the only other receiver top 25 last year who had fewer yards per target than him was Devontae Adams. Listen, there's no reason he can't repeat that kind of performance. Like you said, I think he's got a great floor, but yeah, the ceiling is definitely there. Nobody in front of him scored, fewer touchdowns than he did. If he scores just 2 or 3 more, he moves himself up. So
no, that's fair.
And we don't have the plays in front of it, but Pittman was 9th in red zone targets. He had 19. He caught 14 of them. So is this a situation where he was getting to the 2-yard line? Okay, we're going to give it to Zach Moss, Jonathan Taylor.
Yeah. No,
that's what it seems like.
He was the DeAndre Swift of wide receivers getting tackled at the 1. Let's talk about the Houston Texans wide receivers. You want to talk about a situation that people are dying to try to figure out how they feel about it. So there's 2 ways we can go about this, and we're going to ask both those questions. One way is going to be which one do you want at cost, and the other way is going to be which one do you think is going to actually perform the best by the end of the season. I'm going to go to Adam here first. Adam, when you look at the Texans receivers, which one do you want at cost and why?
Dell is the one at cost that I want the most. No, I'll say that looking at both ECR and my rankings, I also have, Diggs higher than ECR. So I guess I would want him at cost as well. But for me, Dell is the guy that I'm most excited about going ahead and getting. Look, I think he's super explosive. I think he can do a lot with the ball in his hands after the catch. I think he can go down the field. I just think there's a lot of things he does super well. And what's so unique about Tank Dell to me is for a guy that's, short, he's, 5, whatever, he's under 200 pounds. He still gets off the line of scrimmage really well. Like, he actually can play through some contact to the line of scrimmage, which is super impressive for someone in his size, just being a technician off the line.
That's why I was playing the perimeter, surprisingly.
Yeah, exactly. So just that he's not pigeonholed as a slot receiver is so exciting. This is a group that you can actually interchange and move around, and there's a lot of fun things that, there's opportunities for with these receivers. So I'm excited with him, and I think he's just the one to me that has the most upside, because he can do a lot of these things on his own. He doesn't necessarily need Stroud to put him in situations. He can actually just take a short pass and make the play himself.
Yeah, he's the only receiver of this group I actually have ranked ahead of ADP. I mean, he was slightly better than Nico Collins of the first 12 weeks when Collins was the only wide receiver 14 at that point. He was upper echelon in yards per out run at 2.36. His ADOT was ranked 14th at 14.3. He was a great contested catch receiver, as you kind of alluded to there, was 6th. Ranked 6th as a contested catch receiver. Incredible when you talk about a guy of that size. So, Anthony, I'm going to ask you a separate question. Who do you think is the best receiver of this group? Who scores the most fantasy points? Let's put it that way.
I'm all in on Nico Collins. They paid him to be the wide receiver one of the future. They brought in Diggs as a rental. Like, they're not going to tell Nico Collins, hey, you're going to take a back seat to Stephon Diggs, and then once he's out of here next offseason, you're going to be the one again. No, Nico Collins will be the guy. Is there some injury concern with Nico Collins? Yes, he's missed time in each of his first 3 seasons, so, maybe you ding him for that. But when you look at the most complete receiver on this roster, like, Diggs is getting older. He has a lot of wear and tear. I like Tank Dell, but, from A to Z, Nico Collins does everything right. He was a wide receiver 7 in fantasy points per game. Pretty good. He wasn't like a top 10 guy in red zone targets or deep targets, but he got the job done. When you look at yards per reception, he was 9th there, 3rd in yards per target. So I just like everything this guy does. And clearly he has a rapport with CJ Stroud.
Sure. Look, numbers across the board last year were incredible.
He only had 109 targets.
Well, I was just about to point that out. You almost can't mention Nico Collins without also mentioning Brandon Ayuk for the same reason of they were insanely efficient last season, but at the same time, I have concerns about both of their ADPs because it's hard to be that efficient year over year with that little amount of volume. Like you said, only 106 targets, only a 23% team target share. Now you're going to throw Stephon Diggs into the mix. So I do worry about that a little bit because we're talking about a player who until last year, most of us had profiled as just a guy. He wasn't getting open at an incredible rate. He wasn't making big plays. The quarterback was definitely a different scenario. We're not discounting that in any kind of capacity here. But it's somebody who's taken a huge leap. And I just wonder if there's going to be massive potential for regression as a result to that. I don't know if you want to rebuttal to that.
A rebuttal to which part?
As far as maybe pushing back on Nico Collins being able to duplicate what he did last season with the addition of Stephon Diggs, with the needed to have that level of efficiency in order to do it.
Of course, when we're targeting these hyper, in recent memory, guys like Jalen Waddle a few years ago, he was one of the more efficient receivers in the NFL, and it kind of backfired to anybody who drafted him. I think I'm just more willing to take that risk because Waddle had to contend with Tyreek Hill, where I still believe Nico Collins is the alpha in this wide receiver room. So I'm banking on he'll out-target those other guys.
Yeah, I'm following the money. Can't necessarily argue. How about this guy, Christian Kirk? Christian to Chris. I like that. This is a guy, right? He's been the wide receiver one for Trevor Lawrence, essentially. I mean, he's a big reason why I was not big on Calvin Ridley. Thank you, Christian Kirk, because you made me realize he's going to be the safety blanket. That's what he has been. And when he was on the field, he did out-target Calvin slightly, but he did out-target Calvin Ridley even still. So when they add in guys like Brian Thomas, when they add in guys like Gabe Davis, I don't think his role is going to change very much. And it's another guy, kind of like Pittman. I don't know if people get excited about him because he doesn't have the huge upside ceiling, but I feel like you need a couple Christian Kirks on your team to make a championship run. That guy's going to give you that consistent floor. What do you make of him? You got him ranked at 27.
Yeah, I think Danny, you're in the ballpark of the guys that you're looking for. These guys, you're maybe hoping for some more double-digit touchdown opportunities, but not likely. But you're seeing a lot of volume, consistently volume, week in, week out. The best thing about all those things that you just named about the receiver changing is that you have guys who actually fit better roles. Calvin Ridley was being used to stretch the field and clear out roles. I don't know why that was the case, but Christian Kirk now gets to be full-time slot receiver in this offense. Thomas will be on the outside, Gabe Davis on the other side. You'll be able to have Christian Kirk getting simpler one-on-one coverage in the slot. Trevor Lawrence has shown a propensity since college to love this with those slot receivers. So I think you put those things together. You have a guy who has got a solid floor, a guy who has still following the money because he's still getting paid $20 million. I know it seems like chump change nowadays for receivers, but still a pretty good penny. And I think overall, I think Evan Engram was a guy who got a lot of targets last year. Might see a little bit of regression because Christian Kirk's going to be more in that center of that field. So I think Christian Kirk is that guy that's that safe bet for that receiver 2, low receiver 3 option.
Yeah, remember, he had the 5 games cut short, which is a lot of where Evan Ingram's targets came from during that stretch. I want to jump right into Brian Thomas because we finally have our first showdown of the All right, Adam and Chase, you need to get ready here. Anthony's going to judge this debate, by the way. It's Brian Thomas. So the rookie explosive extraordinaire comes in. He comes to Jacksonville, drafted with the first round pick. He is, I would say, more so the replacement of Gabe Davis for Calvin Ridley here. So Adam, you got him at 43. Chase, you got him at 53. So we have a whole tier gap between the two of you. Chase, why don't you go ahead first and tell me why he's down at 53 for you?
Well, let me start by saying I really liked Brian Thomas in the draft, in our draft prep in the lead up. Remember, I had him ranked 4th among the wide receivers just after the big 3 there. And, I think that he can be a good fit in this offense, but he's still a rookie wide receiver. Okay. And last year, if he's going to make wide receiver 43, last year, wide receiver 43 on a points per game basis scored 9.6 points per game. Okay. There were 14 teams in the NFL, almost half the teams in the NFL who had 2 receivers that were over that. Right. So you have to be at least the number 2 receiver on your team to get that. Only 3 of those were rookies though. Tank Dell, Puka Nacua, and Addison in Minnesota. But how did those guys get there? First off, we already talked about Dell was Stroud's favorite guy. Nacua burst out of the scene, but he also played a significant portion of the year without their true number 1, Cooper Kupp. And Addison obviously played a ton of the year without Jefferson there. So, it's already kind of an uphill battle for him to get to the points necessary to make it all the way up to wide receiver 43. But here's my other thing about it. As much as I liked Brian Thomas, as much as I think he can run more routes and more varied routes than he did in college, he did not run a varied route tree at LSU. He was a slant curl go guy. Well, guess who else is a slant curl go guy? The other guy that they paid in free agency this season, Gabe Davis, and brought in. I just think that between the two of them, when they do the exact same thing, I don't know if either one of them gets enough work or takes this role over early enough necessarily. You kind of alluded to it, Dan, that you think that he's the replacement for Ridley. I don't know if he's the replacement right away for Ridley. And even if he is, I think that Davis takes away a lot of the same routes that he runs. So I just don't see him getting to a point where he gets enough points this season to make it all the way up to wide receiver 43. I love him in Dynasty. I'm taking him where I can because, like I said, I was high on him as a player. I just don't know in his rookie season in this environment right now with Gabe Davis there as well, if he can quite make it up to that level with the points that I'm seeing him score this year. Okay.
Adam, what's your rebuttal to that?
Yeah. So for me, when I hit this tier, I'm not necessarily worried about drafting, safe. I'm trying to go yard. When I'm talking about a wide receiver, 43, 45, this tier of guy, we're trying to, like I said, we're trying to go yard. So what I think is super interesting about Brian Thomas Jr., we just talked about Christian Kirk, so let's get this one out of the way. Love Christian Kirk. Think he's a super talented wide receiver. Played over 13 games one time in his career. So odds are high. Brian Thomas Jr. is the wide receiver 1 for at least a handful of games this year. Like, that's odds are pretty decent of that. I mean, I don't know if anyone here thinks Gabe Davis is anything other than just a guy. Not to say that he's not a guy with a similar skill set and NFL experience, like the whole thing, and not to say that he's outright bad, but that Brian Thomas Jr. has been drafted to be more than just a guy. You know, assuming Christian Kirk's injury isn't early in the season, Brian Thomas Jr. should have at least some runway, you know, to get there. I definitely think that he's going to surpass Gabe Davis quickly. And now, Chase, to your point, with the overlapping skill sets, could they eat into each other? Absolutely. Not, you know, disagreeing with that. Just that I do think he'll pass him. Now, the other thing is to get someone this deep that is going to be an outside starter, likely the primary outside starter, again, has to pass Gabe Davis to do that, but I believe in his ability to do so, I think is pretty interesting. Then going back to last season, Trevor Lawrence was a bit more aggressive. Now, he was still one of the quickest time to throw quarterbacks in the league. Let's not, you know, act like he was holding on to the ball long, trying to go super deep all the time, but it was more so than previous years, you know, trying to throw the ball down the field. And that was with Calvin Ridley, who we'll get to and my gripes with, but nonetheless, he was being misused like blatantly last season. They were trying to make him be this clear out deep threat wide receiver as an X, which he is almost none of those things. And because of that, his separation was awful. So they were more aggressive with him being an awful deep separator. And if there's one thing that I'm really confident Brian Thomas Jr. can do, like I think he will develop as a route runner. I think he'll be really good at the contested catch guy. I'm like really, really confident that he's going to separate down the field. Like that's the thing that I'm like, you can definitely do that. So I just think there's a lot of things that point not necessarily to like guaranteed, you know, consistent production, but like there's so many avenues that the upside could come from, whether that's injury to Christian Kirk, whether that's, you know, this offense decides to be a little bit more vertical with him. You know, we haven't really seen that, you know, with this staff here, but we've seen it in Philadelphia with them being a little bit more vertical, especially with the Super Bowl season. So I just think there's a lot of avenues for upside here. And again, I'm trying to go yard when we get into the 40s. And I think that there's a chance, like, if you told me he was wide receiver 60, I wouldn't really bat much of an eye. But also, if you told me he finished the season at wide receiver 30, I think that's very within the realm of possibilities. So that's why I'm interested in Brian Thomas Jr. when we get to this tier.
Okay. All right. Anthony, you tell me which one you agree with more.
I think I agree with Adam more because I do see that variance in range of outcomes for Brian Thomas. What nobody brought up, when you look at this offense, this receiving core, last year, it wasn't only Calvin Ridley they lost. They also lost Zay Jones. They were a top 10 team, and I believe passing yards and pass attempts. Where they weren't very good at is converting in the red zone and passing touchdowns. There's also the factor of Evan Engram, who was one of the more higher targets. If not, he might have led all tight ends in targets last year. So there's definitely a lot of guys here. But if they're still throwing the ball at this high of a rate, it wouldn't surprise me if Brian Thomas, certainly edged out Gabe Davis. I was high on Gabe Davis, one of the highest few years ago. That blew up in my face. I think he's like the Mac Hollins or Zay Jones in this offense, where Brian Thomas was probably drafted to fill in that Ridley role.
Yeah, first of all, Anthony, we're not the only one who Gabe Davis blew up on. I was big on him too. And I want to point that out because no one mentioned that. Gabe Davis was clear-cut the number 2 receiver in Buffalo, but only earning a 14 to 19% target share during that time. I think it's easy Brian Thomas eclipsed that too. So that's just kind of one of 2 cents I wanted to throw in there. All right, Adam, you get the win on that one. We'll see if you can keep the streak alive because now we have another showdown between you and Chris, and this is a 2-for-1. So here's what we got. We got Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins. So first of all, the gap between Chris and Adam on Ridley is huge. Chris has him all the way up at wide receiver 24. Adam's got him down at wide receiver 39. But the twist is here, this is also going to be about DeAndre Hopkins because Adam has Hopkins ranked ahead of Calvin Ridley. So Chris is going to battle out as to why that should not be the case on his side. So Chris, take it up to Calvin Ridley, and then why is he ranked ahead of DeAndre Hopkins?
Well, I'll talk about the Calvin Ridley part. The DeAndre Hopkins and him, it's going to be a little harder for me to kind of argue strongly. But the Calvin Ridley thing is, look, Adam, I know you hate Calvin Ridley, and it's obvious you've hated him since last year, and you scorn lover in some kind of way. But you all admit Jacksonville utilized him in a proper way, didn't have a clue what they were doing. But he still finished receiver 17 last year. He still had 8 touchdowns, still had over 1,100 yards. So this guy who's such a bum, his first year back from being out of football for almost a couple of years, was able to produce at receiver 17. Goes to a team that paid him $50 million guaranteed, is going to feature him as receiver 1 on that team. They keep talking about how they're going to give him the Jamar Chase role. They're going to move him around. They're going to utilize him in different ways to kind of get him the guy as a featured guy as their passing attack. So I look at Calvin Ridley as at 24. I think he's definitely receiver 2 as a guy who's going to have a lot of volume in his passing attack. And I a little bit like the coaching staff in general. I didn't get to comment much about the running backs and Tony Pollard, who, guys, look, he was hurt going in, the year before last year. I keep hearing about the volume thing. I don't think it was a volume thing. I was hurt last year. Let's see what Tony Pollard is when he's healthy the whole season this year. But the offensive changing of guard that we've seen, and this has been Anthony highlighted earlier, bringing in Brian Callahan Sr. in for his offensive line is going to be huge. Now, add the fact that you actually have another talented lineman on this team. They brought in a good center in Kissenberry. So you have 3 linemen that actually could potentially decent versus what they've had in Tennessee for the last 3 or 4 years. It's been horrendous. And then you have a guy who was around quarterbacks like Matthew Stafford, who had his best year with him in Detroit. He was with Peyton Manning when he had his 4 of his best years in Denver. He was with Derek Carr when he had his best year in the Raiders. So now he goes to Will Levis. Is Will Levis the same level as all those guys? No, but we all agree Will Levis has been in position to be, this is your team, and you're going to throw the ball to everybody you want to. So a guy who got paid a lot with a guy who we know that Will Levis loves. Now, this is where I have a hard time, Adam. DeAndre Hopkins over or under Calvin Ridley, Dan? That's harder for me because we saw last year Will Levis is definitely willing to air it out. And he will throw that ball to DeAndre Hopkins come hell or high water. I think DeAndre Hopkins will be that red zone target guy who they're going to look for, a la the T. Higgins role, in a sense. So I do think DeAndre Hopkins still has a lot of upside. It's going to depend on where Calvin Ridley kind of connects with him, because I think Levis does prefer Hopkins right now. I mean, you saw that last year. That was the guy he was looking for consistently, but he didn't have a whole lot of other choices. I do think the Hopkins can still be a guy that I have still in the top 30, because I think the volume is going to be there for both these guys. We've seen this, like I highlighted all those quarterbacks in those different offenses. All the second receiver, as Chase was talking about the different stats, all the second receivers in the offenses all had over 1,000 yards as well, and had over 6 or 7 touchdowns on average. So putting those things together, I think we could see both these guys be really successful. But I think Calvin Ridley to me is a guy that could not be receiver 39. Adam.
Yeah, I'm glad that I got to, shed the AFC South bias with the last one, where I was the higher end on a non-Colts player. So let me just get that out of the way. And second of all, I want to like Calvin Ridley. This has nothing to do with Calvin Ridley, the individual player. I admit going into last season, I wasn't in on him, but that was like, all right, I'm not taking the gamble on someone who missed the year. And then I admit during the season, I was like, I'm glad I didn't do that. He sucks, whatever. Come out of the season. And then I dug into it a little bit more. And Chris, exactly as you said, he was misused. That was not a Calvin Ridley problem. That was a Doug Peterson problem. 100%. So it's like, all right, cool. We get into the offseason. You're on the move. Where do you go? And that's where this falters to me. So I just see this offense shaping out in such a way that, look, part of it was the misuse. Part of it was the misuse. Part of it was the misuse. At the end of the day, Calvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins were both bottom 10 in separation. They were not getting away from corners. To me, who is Will Levis going to prioritize? It's the guy that he already has experience with, the guy that he's had an offseason with already. Cool, that's DeAndre Hopkins. So of the non-separators, I think it's going to be DeAndre Hopkins. It's the alpha. Now, if you disagree with that, then this entire argument falls apart right there. So I'm willing to throw that out there.
Adam, do you think Kyle really is like a terrible route runner? Because the separation part's where you're bothering me. I think that's where the scheme thing does matter.
Yeah, I think it does. I think he's going to, regress to the mean in the sense that he makes it to maybe middle of the pack. But where I was going to get to is, do I think he separates more than Tyler Boyd, who I admit was on the downswing last year, but was one of still the top separators in the league? No, I don't think he passes Tyler Boyd. So we've got the guy that's normally open. We've got DeAndre Hopkins, who I'm pushing the ball to down the field. To me, can Will Levis support a third guy? I'm not sure of that. And it especially comes with the piece of, while I agree this offensive line with Callahan coming in and with the talent is on the upswing, we're talking one offseason with one confirmed good offensive lineman and two guys who are very, very talented and I think in the future are going to be very good offensive linemen. Let's call it a spade a spade. Skoronski was average last year. Like, average. Not bad. Average. He was not great last year. Do I think he will be an above average to great offensive lineman in the future? Absolutely. But am I like super sold on the fact that one offseason with a good coach is going to change that? I'm like, again, once we get 2 off seasons, 3 off seasons, sure, like 100%. Same thing with Latham. I loved him as a prospect. I might have been higher than a couple of you, at least when we were doing our pre-draft. Like, he was my offensive tackle 3. He was pretty close to my offensive tackle 2. Like, I really like Latham. So this isn't like me disliking Latham. It's just the fact that he is a rookie left tackle for a quarterback that holds onto the ball for too long, who is going to get really great coaching, but one off season of it. So on the whole, the build of this offense concerns me in the short term. And again, to me, Calvin Ridley, not necessarily that he's going to be the second option rather than the third option rather than the second, but I just think he overlaps a little bit too much with Hopkins, and I think Hopkins is the superior between them, whereas Boyd is off doing like something different, has a completely different role. So to me, Ridley isn't the bet that I'm willing to make.
All right, Anthony, a lot to unpack there. What do you got?
Yeah, it's close, but I think I side with Chris here.
Okay. That's it? No elaboration?
In terms of this wide receiver room, I feel like I went over it earlier. We were talking about
True.
Will Levis. I think both of these wide receivers, they're veterans. This is one of the oldest wide receiver rooms in the league. I believe they're all over 29 years old.
Yeah.
They're all going to have their role. I think we know what Boyd is at this point. When it comes to the 2 guys on the outside, the 2 alphas, I can see both of them, in terms of fantasy, having a very close finish. And they're probably going to cannibalize each other. So if there's not one I really like more than the other, I'm drafting Calvin Ridley higher. But I do think DeAndre Hopkins is going to be very much in this offense. Like, he's not going anywhere. And he's also worked with Will Levis a little bit longer.
Yeah, agreed. I agree with all that. So we're going to give Chris the win here. And I'll just throw this out there. That Anthony, what you just laid out is why I am lower than ADP on both Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins, because I don't know if they can either one reach their ceilings by eating into each other. And we all know that I'm not a big fan of Will Levis, so I don't think he can get them both the ball as much as they need to outperform it. Let's get into the tight ends, guys, and wrap up the show. So we got Evan Engram here. We all have him as a tight end 1. Right. I mean, Adam's got him at 12. But we all kind of have him at 7, 8, 9 territory. Chase, you got him at 9. It's kind of an interesting situation because the volume's been there the last 2 years for Evan Engram, but it's kind of, he's like the Michael Pittman, actually, of tight ends now that I think about it. He just doesn't
very
score
much
touchdowns.
so.
So,
No,
Chase,
very
you got
much
him at
so.
9. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, no, you hit it right on the head. We talked about earlier with Pittman how he doesn't have a very deep average depth of target. It's the same thing with Evan Engram there. Listen, he was tight end 2 overall points scored. He had the second most receptions for a tight end in history. Okay, so we know that his volume is going to be there, but with now a fully healthy, we hope and assume a fully healthy wide receiver core with Kirk there, with Thomas there, with Gabe Davis there, does he see 143 targets again? I think, and I've made this point last week too. I think about him. You can see some regression. I can see regression in terms of his volume. Okay. Then on top of that, you look at the fact that he was only tight end 6 in terms of half PPR points per game. He wasn't tight end 2 over. People are going to look at that tight end 2 overall finish and the volume, and they're going to think, great. But there are some mitigating factors there. I think he's definitely a top 10, which is why I have him at 9 there, but he doesn't score touchdowns. He doesn't catch the ball downfield. He's very much an underneath threat for this offense. And so, like, go ahead, draft him as a tight end 1, but draft him as one of the later tight end 1s. Don't be looking at that tight end 2 overall finish from last season and thinking that you're going to get Travis Kelce type numbers, Sam Laporta type numbers, because it's not necessarily in the cards for him this year.
Yeah, I mean, his targets ballooned when Christian Kirk went down. He had a 24% target share that led the team, actually. But his first year on the team, 2022, it was 18%, more along the lines of a top 12 tight end, but not in that elite tier as far as volume is concerned. And with the weapons here now, even if Kirk were to go down, I tend to agree. I don't think you would see that 24% target share, but still a tight end 1 nonetheless. I'm just going to skip ahead to Dalton Schultz. Anthony, when you look at Schultz, this is somebody, he got his contract extension. He's been very, very solid no matter what the situation's been around him, no matter what other targets have been around him. But, we still have him as a mid-level tight end too. Do you see any other ceiling besides that or no?
No. And, we talked about this Texans wide receiver room, Joe Mixon, and this offense. Somebody's going to take a hit in targets if everybody's healthy. I think that's Dalton Schultz. And when we go back and look at Schultz, who's been a pretty good, reliable fantasy tight end, he's a volume guy. So unless Dalton Schultz gets his normal volume, and if we go back to 2020, he's had at least 88 targets in every season. If those targets are not there, I don't think we see the same guy in fantasy, which is why I still think he's going to be okay, but I don't have him as a tight end 1. I have him closer to that tight end 15, 16 range.
And that's about the ADP of where he's been going to. Okay, it is time for your Underdog specials. Remember, if you have not played Underdog, you have not signed up, do so. Use the promo code FFAdvice. You get up to $250 in a cash bonus and 1 free pick'em pick, which is what we're about to break down for you guys right here. There's some future pick'ems dealing with this division. So what do I got at the top? CJ Stroud. I got him higher than 4150 on yards here, people. I love it. He was 4108 last year, and now he gets digs on top of it. He only played 15 games last season, so now you get the extra weapon, and if he just plays 2 more extra games, he's definitely going to hit that. So I love CJ Stroud right now, higher than 4,150 yards. Anthony Richardson, I got him higher than 7.5 rushing touchdowns. I don't think this should be too much of a stretch. Again, pretty much just betting on him playing, I don't know, maybe at least 6-7 games, because that's might be all it takes for him to get to 7.5 rushing touchdowns. He had 4 touchdowns in 3.5 games played last year and will always be a threat inside the red zone. Brian Thomas, I got him higher than 800 yards. That's it, 800 yards on Underdog. All he has to do is get 10 yards per target as potentially the second wide receiver in the pecking order. So if he has 80 targets, which should be easy to do for, put it out there. Jackson Smith-Njigba had 93 as the third receiver on his team. Quentin Johnson, as awful as he was, had 67. So he needs 13 more targets than Quentin Johnson last season to get to 80 with a 10 yards per target. With his capability, he should get over that 800 yards pretty easily. Tony Pollard, this is juiced, by the way, times 1.05 your money on Underdog if he just gets over 800 rushing yards. Even if I give Pollard a baseline of a 55% of the team carries, with Spears getting 45, more than generous as the baseline, and he gets back to 4.5 yards per carry. Again, average for a running back starter in today's league. Pollard should be able to do that. He will get over the mark, no problem. Tony Pollard over 800 rushing yards this season. And that is your underdog specials for this show. Anthony, I want to thank you so much for making the time to come on here this Saturday and talk about the AFC South. What's something you got going on, and where should people be checking you out?
You can always follow me at The Real NFL Guru. I do all of my shows and video work at fffaceoff.com, and I am also part of the RotoWire NFL team. So go check me out on the RotoWire YouTube podcast, and hopefully some Sirius XM spots this year.
Awesome. Can't wait. Check out Anthony everywhere you go. He's one of the best in the business. We will be back next week with the NFC South. Follow us on social media at OP Domination FF. We will announce who the guest will be and exactly what time we're going to be live. We're still getting those logistics worked out, but it will be the NFC South that we get to talk about next. Make sure you download Operation Domination on your favorite podcast app and follow us on YouTube at FF Advice Network. You guys have a rest of your good weekend. We'll see you soon. Hey there, I'm proud to say that Underdog Fantasy is the newest sponsor of our show, and it's my favorite place to play fantasy games. No waivers, no trades, no lineup settings, just best ball for season-long drafters all year long. And you gotta check out Pick'em. It's so easy to play. Just pick 2 to 5 stats of your favorite players. You can choose whether they go higher or lower on those stats, and if you can pick 5 in a row, you can win 20 times your money. Sound like fun? Well, guess what? You can sign up with promo code FFAdvice today to claim your special pick, plus a first-time deposit offer up to $250 in bonus cash. I cannot wait to see your entries.